How's it going, Emily?
It's going well. How are you, Mike?
Yeah, doing well, doing well. It's been quite a week at Marveri, but we're getting through it. It's been fun.
It's been
So
good.
let me introduce us. Yeah. Um, I am Mike Dockery. I am former corporate M&A partner at Morrison Forrester, and now I am the director of product and chief legal officer at Marveri. You are the founder and chief technology officer at Marveri, which you founded out of your PhD program in machine learning and AI at MIT. And this is, I should mention, I didn't mention our weird title last time. So this is Turingsaurus Lex. It's a podcast on law and AI presented by Marveri. And today we're going to talk about RAG. And I know that you have a lot of thoughts on RAG. But before we get into your screed, I think we should just set the basics, just sort of make sure everyone understands what RAG is, what it's for, sort of what the purpose, all of that. So can you just explain very simply, like what is RAG? What, I
Yeah,
guess,
for sure.
even the largest step back we can take, what does RAG stand for?
Yeah, so RAG stands for Retrieval-Augmented Generation. And effectively, I know we talked about context windows last time, and I think that's something that when, for example, you just have too much context, for example, if you're working with all of the documents in a company system and you're trying to create a question answer system and it's just way too much for any context window to handle, or you want to be able to provide more targeted information, smaller models, things like that, we can use RAG to help with this. And just to give you an idea of the most simple component of RAG, so the problem, right, effectively is that you have way too much text for any particular model. And so the solution is, and sort of the most basic version of RAG is, what if we chop up all of the text or all the documents into particular components? We use an embedding model, which is, so I know last time we talked about how effectively machine learning models take language and turn it into numbers and then turn it back into language. And so an embedding model is sort of does that first part of that transformation. And so you can effectively sort of encode your language into this sort of numerical value, and you can use that value to determine how similar a particular piece of text is to other pieces of text. And I only say this is because the way that you use RAG, or the simplest version of RAG, is that you can chop up your document into smaller documents. You use an embedding model to encode these into numbers or vectors. And then when you get your query, you can use the similarity between your query or whatever incoming text you have to which documents you would need to answer your question in the question answer retrieval example. Does that make sense? I'm happy to try to break it down
Yeah,
further.
no, it does. I think, I mean, so let me try and restate it and then you tell me where, if I'm wrong. Hopefully I won't be, but um, to me, I've always thought about RAG as like you said, so context windows, especially a couple of years ago, used to be much smaller than they are now, to the point that like you couldn't even get like one contract, for example, into context. So the model just could not comprehend that amount of text. So you have to figure out a way to essentially search over the text, find the most relevant chunks of the text, and then take that out so you can stick a much smaller amount of text into context. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's perfect. It's super similar to search, actually. The way Google search ranks all of the documents on to the most relevant to your particular query. RAG does that as well, sort of using the same similarity to the search or whatever information is coming from the user.
Okay. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So we don't have to go into like legal tech too deeply, but yet. But I think that explanation sort of gets to like how RAG is used in legal tech in particular, because I could imagine, right? Like if you're one of the thousands of legal research chatbots that's out there, like you have to search over a massive amount of documents. Like even if you were just looking at, say, I want to find some particular Supreme Court case, that's a huge amount of text. There's just no way, even with models now, you wouldn't be able to fit every Supreme Court case ever into context. And so you have to do some processing up front to try and figure out, okay, which of these are at least seem to be relevant. And so I assume a lot of the legal research tools use RAG, but even more broadly, like I've seen RAG sort of touted as a way of like eliminating hallucinations, for example. Like, so can you just talk about like some of those? Like, why do we see these RAG models so prominent in the legal circles?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the context component. I feel like, especially in the legal circles for legal research, just the amount of context you need to search over is huge. A lot of these databases are only recently digitalized and things like that as well. And so, sort of being able to search effectively, RAG is actually pretty good at that, particularly if you're trying to find one particular piece of information and you have a lot of context on it. I mean, everyone has used Google before. You might have used ChatGPT search. Um, I think that's a little bit more complex than just having RAG in the background, but effectively sort of this ranking in a numerical system in terms of the search functionality is very well developed as well. And so I think to answer your original question though about hallucinations, just to maybe take a step back, I'm sure everyone, a lot of people have heard about hallucinations. It's a very hot topic, but effectively hallucinations happen, or what hallucinations are, is when a model makes up information effectively, or responds in a way that is incorrect, and is not based off of sort of if you're using ground source documents that you're providing the model, it doesn't actually cite anything or it makes up a quote. I know there's a really famous case out of New York when ChatGPT 3 came out where it made up case law. And this was submitted in a brief. And then I think the lawyer who was involved got disbarred. So
Yeah,
hallucinations.
those cases have been in the news a lot. There was one recently with the My Pillow case that it's not really clear what exactly happened. So what their lawyers are saying is like we had Chat GPT or some AI, I don't know if they specified, produce this brief, and then we sort of we took the brief. We of course checked it and refined it and all of that, but then we accidentally submitted the original text that the model produced, and so it's got all these made up cases and citations and everything. And I think there's been quite a few more of those cases, but yeah, I've kind of been on record like trying to push for hallucinations as like distinct from just a mistake, because I see some usage actually of it's just like any mistake that the model makes is a hallucination, but I tend to think of it a little bit differently, just because I think like if that's what it means, then why don't we just say it made a mistake? But I think there's this particular kind of error that like large language models can produce that is something that's worth putting a term on. And it's because, and I'd love to hear like your more technical discussion of like why this happens. But my understanding is like the model doesn't have a way of like just saying an easy way, or at least the early models never had an easy way of saying I don't know. Like it's trying to produce text, and it's if it has something in its in its quote unquote memory banks to give as an actual answer, it'll do that. If it doesn't, it's just going to make something up because it's just going to produce text. It's so I tend to think of hallucinations as that kind of error, like it's making something up that sounds really plausible, and which is the worst kind, right? Because you're not going to recognize it by just reading it.
Exactly. From a technical perspective, I know we talked a little bit about model training last time in context windows, but effectively, when you train a model, you're learning these long-term relationships between words, and you're trying to effectively. So the model, when it's doing training, it's effectively playing a very fancy form of fill in the blank, where given sort of a series of words, what is the most likely word or a series of words to come next? Based on sort of all of the data that it's trained on, which is a large portion of the internet. And so there isn't any sort of guarantee of factuality. It's sort of almost like what is sort of it's built in a distributed manner to sort of piece together what is the most likely series of words, which is why it sounds so plausible, because it's sourced from sort of the collective information. And I think there's actually a super interesting thing that happened when ChatGPT first came out. I think there was like a collection of folks on maybe some subreddits or something that decided that they wanted to just lie about our particular fandom. And that's actually baked into ChatGPT now, where if you ask questions about it, it will sort of by just writing tons and tons of posts, sort of describing lies about the fandom, and sort of things like that. And so that's why ChatGPT hallucinates. It's not really, it's kind of built in as a feature rather than a bug in some sense, where the reason why it's so powerful is because it's able to sort of leverage this information in a way that kind of utilizes the collective knowledge of what should come next or what feels reasonable to sort of in a linguistic way.
Yeah, I mean, I won't drag us down the AI governance rabbit hole too much, but one of the things that people are worried about, right, is like government actors could essentially just seed the training data by pouring tons of just fake information onto the internet to be scraped and then used in training new models. So that's actually one thing that's, the models are just based on what it gets, and so it doesn't have any access to the real world to verify anything. But, and maybe that's a good transition, so like how does RAG solve that problem of hallucinations, or does
Yeah.
it solve it?
So I actually think RAG is a little bit separate from hallucinations, because at the end of the day, when you're using RAG, you get the reason why RAG is helpful is because it allows you to get uh, shorter segments of more relevant information effectively, sort of using this search algorithm. And you can use that smaller context to then provide a more targeted answer, especially when you have so much information. And in kind of how we're talking about context windows, even if you have a model that can take in a huge context window, and this problem has been getting better over time, but there's sort of the needle in the haystack middleman problem, right? Where like if you have a very long context, finding a particular piece of information, if it's in the middle of the document, is much harder than if it's sort of at the beginning or the end, or if it's a shorter segment of information and things like that. This allows us to provide sort of higher quality information, more targeted information to the model, but the model itself can still hallucinate. So if you think of RAG as the retrieval system that you then can use to sort of feed your model or your LLM system or your agentic system or whatever you want to do, that system itself can still hallucinate. You can go back and backtrack and use sort of deterministic methods to make sure that the quotes that you find are still in the original source material, but there's nothing effectively that sort of prevents the hallucinations from happening without sort of other intervention. Even if you have a RAG system, it might be more likely to have better information and like because you retrieved better context, but there is no sort of hallucination guarantee just because you retrieve better information in the beginning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. So I gather essentially RAG is not affecting the underlying model at all. It's just affecting essentially your prompt. It's like adding to the question that you're asking by going out and finding some relevant information to sort of inform the model's answer, but the model is answering in the same way that it would answer any other question. It's just got sort of you're giving it more information and upfront that may be relevant. I guess I mean we should put aside the reasoning models, I guess, because I think with the reasoning models there's more back and forth, but like the non-reasoning sort of purely large language models, you're still rolling the dice, right? Like if there it could still be the case that there's nothing relevant to some particular point that the model thinks it needs to make, and then it just makes stuff up.
Yeah, exactly. From like sort of the pure RAG, like simple LLM query, that query, even if it has higher quality information, there is no, if it has some rate of hallucination, there is no guarantee that there will be no hallucination with the higher quality information. So I would almost think of a RAG system as something that's really helpful for information retrieval, but that I also think RAG itself has a lot of problems, which we can go into, that people have tried to address in various ways. Some ways are very similar to reasoning models, actually, but effectively, there is no guarantee. If with the same underlying model, there is no guarantee that without any sort of further intervention or double checking, that there will be no hallucinations.
Yeah. Yeah, well, no, let's get into the juicy stuff. Like, yeah, I definitely want to hear your rant about RAG. I can tell you, like, some of the problems I've seen, particularly for legal, one is like the chunking doesn't always make sense, right? So basically, RAG is going to break the document up into smaller size chunks. And then those chunks get fed into the model. So it tries to find the most relevant chunk and then it feeds that into the model. But, you know, you can imagine with like a long agreement, for example, each chunk may have defined terms. Those defined terms may be super important to how that provision is interpreted. That provision may be spot on relevant for the question that's being asked, but the model may just pull that provision and plug it into context. But the model, you know, RAG doesn't know that this long definition that in itself is not particularly relevant to what's being asked is vital for like interpreting the provision that it's feeding into the model. And then here that just provides another place where the model itself can fill in the blanks with, you know, very, very plausible sounding gibberish.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's a good outline of a lot of the problems in RAG. I think maybe from a little bit more of a technical perspective, to kind of break down each of those individual problems. Right. So exactly what you said. The chunking itself might be done poorly, right? Do you want a chunk per paragraph? Do you want a chunk per document? If it's a whole document that's like 2,000 pages and the information that is relevant is just one page, and you run an embedding model over the entire document, the likelihood of sort of that semantic viability of that information is suddenly a lot lower than if you were to chunk by paragraph. Versus like if there's a different question, it might actually be vice versa, things like that. So like the chunking might not be good in a way that's relevant to your problem. So that's kind of problem one. The second problem is that the embedding models might not be well targeted to your problem as well. So like sort of GPT embedding large, text embedding large, it's a really incredible encoding model, but the problem, right, is that it's not developed for a legal specific context. So if you were to just sort of encode or like create embeddings for the summaries of an entire data room worth of legal documents, in general, those embeddings are super similar. Because across the context of all documents that exist, legal documents are pretty similar to each other. And so you might not even get, it was not trained for being specialized in legal. There are some embedding models out there now that do. We also actually use Voyage AI, their legal specific embedding model for some of our more quantitative for our system. But in general, even if you train a legal specific model, it might not be well targeted to your specific problem. And so the embedding model specificity might not be great. And kind of the third portion of that is that when you ask a question, that question might not be very semantically similar or detailed enough to be able to retrieve the correct information. And so what do I mean by that? Like, let's imagine you have some sort of, if you're trying to implement some sort of RAG system to do question answering in a company data room with thousands of documents, hundreds of thousands of documents, and the query that you want to run is something that's more complex, like do due diligence. If you were to take that take that question and turn it into a numerical value, that might not be semantically similar to a lot of the documents that you have, but those documents might be really important for doing that task. And so it sort of limits your ability to, if the question and the responses are not semantically similar, the information that you retrieve might also not either cover the entire space. It might be hard to retrieve those. And that's actually a problem that people have found generally with RAG, is that there's sort of problems along all of these dimensions, from what you're retrieving to like actually getting the information that you're looking for. So
Yeah,
those are a little bit
really, it's really interesting. Like, I never really thought about that sort of scope point where, like, yeah, exactly as you said, if you take the entirety of the internet, then anything that's involved in legal specific is going to be closer in sort of semantic space than, whatever, Dr. Seuss books, whatever. But that embedding model is going to be trained to see automatically all legal documents as sort of a space. And so, yeah, that's really interesting. I never really thought of that. And it almost like, it almost the problem scales even as you go down. If you go into, okay, well, let's just then look at legal documents. Well, okay, but the question may be directed just to, regulatory questions about the import of whatever. And within that legal space, any of the language about regulations of, rabbit food import or whatever, that all is going to be its own sort of semantic spaces very close to each other. And so you're not going to get the fine-grained detail. It's almost like a chaos problem, right? Like it seems like the level of definition for the semantic space you want to search is always going to be difficult to suss out a priori. You almost need like a meta model to pick the scope. That's really interesting. I had never thought about that.
That's exactly, actually, I think, to be frank, I think that's actually very similar to what research does. And maybe I can give a high-level overview of all the things that have been tried. Like, for example, whenever, I don't know if you've used ChatGPT research before, but and if any of the viewers have, but when you first ask a question, usually the first thing that comes after is they ask you to clarify the question, and you can see when it's thinking that it's adding more context to the question that you're asking, to sort of help with search. So the more context that you can give your query at the time of search or the time of retrieval, usually the better retrieval results you can get as well. And they kind of built this into the deep research system. And effectively, there's a lot of solutions people have tried to develop. There's like different fancy chunking methods where you can try to have overlaps of your chunks to give better, to give you a better probability of getting the correct information. There's things that people have built called re-rankers, which it's exactly as it sounds like. You retrieve some information using RAG, and then you can re-rank it just within sort of that smaller context to hopefully make the higher quality information higher within the ranking system. There's a lot of other methods that are super clever that try to introduce more variation. And what I mean by that is when, like, even for things like reasoning models, what they do is that they go back and revise the information or create a secondary copy, and do comparisons and things like that. And that hopefully gives you a higher, that sort of almost like is a retry of the system, right? And that allows you to get another pass to try to see if you can get the right answer, quote unquote. And there's systems like Hebbia where they recently released a blog post, or I guess not recently, a few months ago, where they solved RAG. And effectively what they do is that they also try to introduce more variation. And so effectively, instead of just a single query, a single retrieval response, you can actually modify, they add more variation by modifying the query. So instead of, can you find all anti-assignment agreements? Can you find all anti-assignment agreements with different variations? Give you a higher probability of retrieving the right answer because you get more tries effectively at the problem and things like that. And these sort of variation increasing methods are, I think what's similar across these methods is that they're trying to give you a better chance of getting the right information, even if that's not fully a guarantee.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess another problem that I've seen, and actually I've seen this more on like the coding side, on when I've been trying to play around with Cursor, is just like, look, the RAG can cram more information into context, but context is still limited. And sometimes you just need more information. Like you just can't cram enough information in. And so it ends up losing, it loses the overall view because it's just pulling very specific stuff into context. And I mean, I'm sure you have much more experience on the coding side. But you could also easily see how that would apply to something like legal research, right? Like it can still only cram so much into context. And so like if there are 50 cases that need to be reviewed in order to get the view of whatever particular issue is in front of the court, and it only grabs 30 because that's all it can fit in, then the answer's wrong almost by definitions, or it makes something up.
Totally agree. Yeah, I actually, I think when you're, I think for the coding problem too, if you're trying to create a new function or a new functionality, the first thing you have to identify is what files do I need to change or look at. And I definitely remember, I think cursor agents are getting better at this, but the best one I found so far is Claude, actually. But that's the first problem you have to solve, which files are relevant, and they still get that wrong. And I think what sort of helps Claude is that when you first start up Claude in your terminal, they ask you to create a summary document for your repository. And the more detailed that summary document is, it's sort of almost like a README. And the system refers to that README in order to sort of navigate and figure out what files might need to be touched. And so it's almost like a high-level summary of the capabilities of the system in the context of the repository and the concrete code to help with navigation. And that, I think, actually helps a lot in terms of identifying which files need to be pulled for any particular functionality, even though it still will get that wrong. And then the agent goes in and reads those files and tries to make modifications and things like that. But I don't want to go too down that rabbit hole. I kind of just wanted to mention that overall summary as like being really, really helpful as well.
Yeah, makes sense. So I think we should just touch on, so last time we talked about context windows, we talked about how they are getting larger and larger. And then as you just explained, like really what RAG was a way to get around these small context windows that existed in early models. So I guess the question becomes, as context windows get larger and larger, like we talked like last time, they are getting enormous. I think Gemini 2.5 Pro is at 1 million tokens now. There's some meta models that are like out at 10 million tokens. The crazy huge context. So for me, the question becomes like, at what point does RAG just become irrelevant? Or is it the case that actually, okay, well, now you have 1 million tokens you can put into context, and you can use RAG to cram 1 billion tokens into that million? Like, how do you see that dynamic playing out?
No, that's a great question. So I think kind of breaking it down into I think the problem of search is never going to become irrelevant. You're never going to build a model with an infinite number of like a context window. And moreover, if you're trying to find particular information, like I want to find a specific clause or a specific, I'm looking for a particular, like maybe the terms of someone's IP assignment agreement, it almost feels like it's going to take so much longer to just dump all the documents you have into even if it fits into the context window, dumping all the documents you have in order to search for that result. First, it's expensive. The inference will take a long time, and it's unnecessary. So I think the problem of search itself is never going to become irrelevant. I do think that RAG and sort of the embedding-based similarity, there's definitely going to be use cases, but I think for more complex tasks, people are starting to notice sort of this combination of reasoning has been helping a lot, which is how can we expand on the problem? How can we sort of go back and sort of revise our searches rather than, or how can we summarize in order to get a higher level understanding rather than just directly sort of chopping and feeding into like a traditional RAG system. And so I guess, I don't know if that exactly answers the question. I don't think the search and retrieval component will ever be useless. I just think it's going to be necessary for any sort of organizational flow, any large scale system that anyone would need to build. And the corollary to that is I feel like people are figuring out clever methods to give you a higher probability of retrieving the right information, whether that be through reasoning or through re-ranking or through summarization, things like that.
Yeah, that does make a lot of sense. I mean, personally, I think I guess it just depends on the problem, right? It doesn't matter how big the context windows get. I don't see them anytime soon, maybe ever, because of the way you described last time of compute and cost and energy. Just they increase enormously as you add more context. And so if you try and imagine the sort of the task, for example, of ingesting every federal court case and putting that into context, like, you may be able to do that after you sort of, build our Dyson sphere and harness all the power of the sun. But like at some point, it just, there's no way, right? It's just it's so much cost. It would be so slow. So I think there will be tasks out there that still require some sort of retrieval. It may not be RAG in particular, but I think as those context windows grow, like in other tasks, they do sort of fall away from needing to use RAG at all, because like, I mean, not even recently, like a year ago, I think the context windows became sufficient to like ingest a single contract and review it directly into context, where that's something that people were actually using RAG for early on. So yeah, it just depends on the problem set to me. Cool. Well, like, I don't know, is there any, if you want to rant or rip on RAG anymore, any other aspects, happy to hear it. I love it. But
Yeah, I mean, I personally, I'm very skeptical of the direct just embedding retrieval component. I feel like a lot of the things that I've seen that are that I think work pretty well, some very similar to what we have implemented in our system, is almost implementing sort of a table of context or almost like a catalog of summaries that we can then look through, things like that. And I think that is a lot more promising because the context ones are large enough that you can sort of feed the entire catalog in, even if you can't feed in all the content. And that those catalogs are a lot more tailored to the information that we're looking to retrieve. But yeah, thanks for listening to my rants on, mostly I just like talking about the problems about RAG.
Yeah.
Because I feel like every component, if you really sort of dig deeper, you're like, oh, well, these problems can happen here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've heard your outside of this forum, I've heard your thoughts on RAG. And so it's always to me, I always get a little bit of a cringe because you do hear very often, oh, well, yeah, the models hallucinate, but there's always RAG. So we've solved that. Like, it's not an issue anymore. And I'm just like, please don't tell people that, because like it's not true. I mean, like it is there, it helps, but it doesn't solve the problems, and it can create other problems. Awesome. Well, yeah, it's been great talking to you. Let me just wrap us up here. So this has been the Turingsaurus Lex podcast. Presented by Marveri. Marveri is an AI-powered platform that helps corporate lawyers quickly make sense of large groups of documents. It's super useful for M&A, for onboarding new clients, really any legal task that requires quickly digging into a large bunch of documents. So if anyone wants to learn more about Marveri, please go to marveri.com, marveri.com, and sign up for a demo. We love showing off the tool. Appreciate everyone listening to these. Would love to hear feedback. If anyone has feedback, please drop comments. You can find Marveri on LinkedIn. You can find Emily and I on LinkedIn. We are going to be planning other content. We're going to keep talking about AI and the law here on this podcast, but we're planning some webinars on some really interesting topics, bringing in some great guests, talk about things like legal ethics, use of AI, those sorts of things. So follow Marveri on LinkedIn if you want to find that content. You can also subscribe to us here on YouTube. Great talking to you today, Emily. Look
So
forward
much.
to next time.
Yeah, this was great.
Bye.